So I'd like to welcome everyone to our Rehabilitation Health virtual course, Understanding Cognitive Bias and Its Effects on Business and Health with Pete Denninger. Today's session, the second session of the course, is about overconfidence. All courses, conversations, and shows are interactive, so please type your questions in the chat function, take yourself off mute. We really want to make sure this is interactive. We're answering everyone's questions, and it's just a really fun experiential session. So Rehabilitation Health is an experiences and creation platform for health professionals, subject matter experts, and health students to bring ideas to life and create successful ventures. And with that, I want to turn it over to Pete.
Great, thanks David, and thank you to everyone for joining this week. What we're going to do today, as David alluded to, is after the first session, which really was more of an introduction to cognitive and behavioral biases, we're going to start drilling into some specific ones. And the one that we're targeting today is overconfidence, which is truly one of the most pervasive of the biases that we see. We really start to see it everywhere. What we're going to do is we're going to go into exploring a number of the forms that it takes. We're going to walk through a number of the different settings where we see overconfidence in the real world. And we're going to explore some of the tools that we can use as techniques to really lessen its influence. So to jump into it, I just want to reiterate what David said. Really want to keep this interactive and hear your thoughts. So either utilize the chat function or just, as David said, take yourself off mute. Feel free to interrupt me with any questions or comments that you'd like to make. So with that, I think a number of you have gotten to know me, but for those who haven't, just a quick highlight. I'm a member of the Rehabilitation Health team helping out with finance, and also I'm the operator of Altivus Consulting, which has partnered with Rehabilitation Health to offer some strategic growth advisory services. Prior to that, a lot of my career had been spent in the investment management industry, and it was really my time as a professional investor that gave me a real window into a lot of these biases and really developed the interest in them that has stayed with me throughout my career. So this is one of my favorite cartoons, and I think it does a great job of just highlighting some of the underpinnings of overconfidence. And I think it's something that we all can relate to. So the question is, where do overconfident people live? Lake Wobegon, Garrison Keillor's fictional Minnesota town where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, and all of the children are above average. So what exactly do we mean by overconfidence? I think that we have a general sense of it, but really what it is it's an illusion, a fairly positive illusion that causes us to think that we're better than we really are. And this manifests itself in the business setting for sure. It can manifest itself in the medical setting, but in a lot of the decisions that we make and the way that we approach many aspects of our lives. For example, we have the tendency to assume that our judgments or the assumptions that we're making are the right ones. We give ourselves way too much credit for our intellect and the talents that we possess than evidence might suggest is appropriate. We tend to overstate the amount of control that we have over a variety of situations, many of which are random situations that are completely out of our control. We tend to think that we rank higher than other people in many categories. So we give ourselves a little bit of that superiority complex. And we also, as a corollary to that, we tend to minimize the impact of competition. And it can be competition in business, in a startup, it can be competition in other aspects of our lives in the academic setting. So confidence, though, isn't necessarily bad, right? What's wrong with being confident? And we can see on the left, Harvard Business School psychologist Amy Cuddy in the power pose that she has really highlighted is advantageous to us in helping to inflate our sense of confidence to help us deal with difficult situations. So confidence in and of itself can be a very good thing. It can enhance the overall sense of well-being that we have as we go through life. It can be additive to the perception that other people have of us. If we look confident, then they tend to think that we are more successful or maybe more powerful in a higher position than we actually are. Being confident can help us deal with some of the knocks that life throws at us. It can make us more resilient in dealing with disappointment or failure. And having that confident approach, striking that power pose, can help us go into situations that we might be more naturally fearful of. So confidence isn't really where we're making an indictment or talking about the bias, but overconfidence is. And I love this quote from Gandhi: "It's unwise to be too sure of one's own wisdom. It's healthy to be reminded that the strongest might weaken and the wisest might err." So there is evidence. This is not just something that is intuitive. There's been a lot of research, and you can see the number of the sources that are cited at the end of the presentation. But there's overwhelming research that overconfidence can actually hurt our ability to learn, especially learning from mistakes that we all make. It can have an impact on the decision-making caliber that we demonstrate. It can cause us to set goals that are unrealistic, to think that we can do more than we can, or that is reasonable. It can also cause us to overestimate value. That can be the value of something that we possess. It could be the value of something that we have created, whether that is a business or whether that is a work of art. And it can cause us to overestimate the value of something that we are negotiating for, looking to acquire. It can also cause us to claim too much credit for a success. And given that that credit is more of a fixed quantity, the more that we are applying to ourselves, the less credit that we are directing to where it may very well be due. Overconfidence can cause us to be less fair. If we think that we have brought more to the table than the reality of the situation is, then we may not be as fair to others as we should be. And while we said that confidence can help us deal with some of the failures and disruptions in life, being overconfident can actually have the other effect, and it can cause us to incur more psychological damage than would be the case if we had more balance. And lastly, it can also cause us to start going down that slippery ethical slope, that if we are allowing our belief in ourselves to dictate our actions, it can cause us to maybe cut some ethical corners. So I'm going to give a couple of examples, but I'd like you to be thinking about where you might have encountered overconfidence, either in your own life or what you've seen in others. The examples of this are really everywhere. There are some examples that are pretty innocuous. You can think about the example of you have texted or emailed somebody and are waiting for a response, but yet you are able to get inside the head of those people. You know what they're thinking. You know what the fact that they haven't responded means. It could also be a situation that is pretty true to my life, is somebody's talking, and even before they're able to finish the sentence, you know where they're going with that, and you don't even need to hear the rest of it because you already have been able to determine what they're thinking and what the point is they're going to make. That's something that I can assure you my wife is very familiar with. But there are also more serious and more grave situations in which we see that. We can think back to the 1986 Challenger explosion. That was a situation where there was a questionable O-ring that hadn't in fact been tested at the temperatures when that launch was taking place on that morning, but yet those who were making the decision of go or no go were sufficiently confident that even in this untested situation, it was going to be fine. Another situation that I can take from my own life was when I was managing what was an $8 billion growth portfolio. One of my team members came to me and said, well, Twitter is going to be reporting earnings later this afternoon. I think we should buy some in the fund before they report. So in going through the reasons why this recommendation was being made, it was, well, my gut's telling me this would be a good thing to do. There wasn't anything that had followed any process. It was more of just the market, I think, is telling me that we should do this. We ended up not making that purchase since there wasn't really more to the recommendation than that, which was a good thing because Twitter was down over 15% the next day after they blew the quarter. So I'd love to hear from folks on the line, either through chat or if you want to just take yourselves off mute. Have there been any situations where overconfidence is something that has shown up in your life?
I'll talk about a situation for me.
Sure.
I started, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, starting to be a little more active in the stock market.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I tried to be pretty cognitive of buying more what I would call the growth technology stocks and then more long-term stocks. But, you know, at one point I was really high on the concept of GoPro, the combination of the hardware technology. I was overconfident that based on their drop-in, they would actually be able to get their stuff together because they had such a market-leading advantage.
Yeah.
So I bought GoPro and then I doubled down a little as they kept going down. And, you know, now they're at like, I don't know, $5 a share or something, never recuperated, minimal loss, but it was completely overconfident that this combination of hardware, software, the previous success, the team they had in place, the CEO could continue. And it was also lack of due diligence on my part, understanding what's actually going on behind the scenes with the company, what people are doing in their free time, other things like that. And so for me, it was a good lesson because it was not much money and it was early on, but it was definitely, I was overconfident with GoPro.
Yeah, that's a great example, David. And definitely one where allowing our intuition or our perception to give us that feeling of confidence. And even in a situation like buying a stock, where if you're buying it, somebody is making the decision to sell it to you. As it goes down and more people have obviously been selling it, that feeling of, hey, I know this is still going to work out, I'm confident in the decision that I made is a really good example. Does anyone else have any examples that come to mind before we kind of delve into a few more situations?
I can't think, Pete, of a specific example, but I know that I have totally been guilty of my overconfidence in the amount of influence I wield. Like when someone comes to you and says, let's say you're serving on a board and they come and they say, well, this is, you know, they proffer some something they want done, and I know that I've often had too much confidence in my ability to influence others. I just think, oh, I got this. Like I can make this happen, and then I can't. And maybe
Right.
you know, lesson learned, right? Like maybe I ought to chill out a little bit and not think that I'm going to be able to. It's just an easy one to go too far for me, I guess, is this idea that that you have more influence or that you're in some station that you truly are not, because you just see yourself more shining and glowingly than is the truth.
Absolutely. That is definitely a pretty important aspect of overconfidence and the manifestation of it that we'll be getting into a little bit more shortly. I'm just curious though, in those situations where you realized you didn't have as much influence as you thought you did, the next time you were in that situation, did you find yourself back in that same scenario, or?
That's a good question. I have been humbled on enough occasions, kind of like we were talking about on the last call about like once you've gone so far down the rabbit hole, you like learn your lesson. I think I've kind of gotten to the place where I go into everything much more cautiously than I did before, with a lot more like hopeful attitude, but set lower expectations. Lower your expectations, right?
Right.
Like, somebody asked me to do something, I'm going to go give it my best effort to influence those people, but no promises, right? And that way, if I fall apart or if I fail, I haven't, raised someone else's expectations. So I'm definitely more careful than I used to be.
Yeah, and even if it is something that continues to persist, I will say that overconfidence, of the biases that we'll be talking about, overconfidence is one of the things that it's very difficult to control. It's very difficult to will ourselves to have a different approach. And that's why we really have to rely on some techniques that effectively impose some guardrails on us. And we'll be getting into those shortly. I'm just looking here in the chat. It looks like Nick was saying he encountered it recently while learning how to surf. Maybe the concept where you don't know how little you know until you try something out and learn more. I think absolutely, Nick, that is definitely part of it. And one of the things that we have found and that the research has revealed is that in those situations where we maybe don't acknowledge how much we don't know, causes us to be in a situation where we overestimate what we're going to be able to accomplish. So before we go on, I'll just, anyone else have anything that they wanted to share?
Pete, I won't go into a ton of detail here, but related to Nick's mention, mine was mountain biking and resulted in 3 broken ribs. Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes those lessons can be not just psychological.
I watched 3 or 4 guys go off of this thing down at Bear Claw Poppy, south of St. George, called the Middle Finger of Death, and thought, sure, this looks easy.
I've picked a few people up, Ross, off the ground right there. With broken wrists, broken ribs. It's just tricky because it catches your back tire and
sure does.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Ross. I'm glad you lived to tell this tale. But it is definitely a situation, especially when we see other people doing it, that we think, hey, how hard can that be? I'm at least as talented as those people are capable. And sometimes we find out the hard way that we're not. So what I wanted to do now is we're going to jump into some of the different aspects of overconfidence, and that there are 3 O's. The first of which is overestimation. This is one type of overconfidence, and this is thinking that we're better than we are. So a lot of what we were just talking about, we think that we possess greater skills, more talent than our experience or maybe a reasonable assessment would cause us to. What we really blame there is what's called the endowment effect. And we have a tendency to overvalue things that we own. And that's not limited to physical or monetary things. It includes our own attributes. And so something that is specific to us, we tend to overvalue. One of the other things that leads to this endowment effect is that there are a lot of aspects of our lives that we self-select. We tend to choose what we want to study, what we want to specialize in, where we want to study, what careers do we want to pursue. And when we've made those decisions, we have a tendency to want to justify them. And so things that are specific to those educational decisions, those career decisions, we will overinflate our sense of capabilities in areas that relate to that. So that's another aspect of that endowment effect. We also have the illusion of greater control than we do. We think that we have the ability to control outcomes that may be totally out of our hands and in some cases are just random. And that's one of the reasons why you see in a lot of aspects, whether it be business, health, sports, This reliance on superstitions. Well, you know, if I do this, it's more likely to lead to this outcome, or I can't do that, or it's going to derail this, because we feel that there is more control than we have. It results in rituals that are being used, and also just the denial of situations that are totally random, whether it be in a gambling situation or some other manifestation where we just don't deny, or we do deny the fact that randomness is really what's determining the outcome, not what we're doing. We also, as part of overestimation, have a tendency to engage in some really spurious planning assumptions. So what's called the planning fallacy. We will overestimate different aspects of future projects and outcomes that we're engaging in. We tend to overestimate or in some cases underestimate the complexity. We overestimate the time frame that we're going to be able to accomplish something, how we're going to be able to do that within a given budget, what our chances of success are. And that's something that we see over and over again in a number of different settings. And one of the interesting things about overestimation is this has a tendency to apply more to difficult tasks than to easy ones. So to the point of what Nick was saying and Ross's example, it's almost the harder that it is, the less that we are aware of what we don't know, and then potentially what our limitations are. The second O is overplacement. So in overestimation, we were thinking that we were better than we are. In overplacement, we think that we place ahead of others. We're better than other people. And this is really where that Lake Wobegon effect of everyone is above average lives. This is a tendency that can lead us to really be competition seeking. We embrace competition because we think we are better, stronger than the other competitors. So we have a tendency to minimize or just flat out ignore the presence of competitors who might have a solution, an offering, an approach that is at least as good as ours. That can cause us to overplay our hand when we are in a negotiating situation. It can, for example, cause us to be more optimistic about the potential for entrepreneurial success. And it's something that can lead us to be overly eager in pursuing M&A strategies because we have the feeling that we know the situation and are able to achieve a better deal than potentially the person who is selling this to us, who arguably has more knowledge of the situation. One of the reasons here that causes this is that we don't set what are the right base rates. We talked about that a bit in the last session. And the base rate is what is the relevant group baseline or benchmark that we are comparing ourselves to. We may in fact be smarter or more talented in some capacity than the general population, but if that's not really who we're competing against or that we need to compare ourselves to, then that's not really the right base rate that we're using. And what is interesting and maybe a little bit counterintuitive is that while in overestimation, we saw that that was more prevalent in harder tasks than in easy tasks, it's the opposite for overplacement. So in easier tasks, we have a greater tendency to think that we're better than other people in, as opposed to the situation in a really hard task where we may feel that hey, this looks really challenging. There must be people who are better at it than I am if this is something that has a lot of difficulty or complexity to it. So for this one, I wanted to revisit the questions. This will be familiar for those of you who took the introductory quiz before the last session, but for those who haven't, we'll just kind of do a quick recap. So this was a question that asked, relative to other participants in the course, how would you classify yourself on a scale of 1 to 9 versus others? So in terms of ranking your ethical character, ranking your work habits, and ranking your driving ability, with 1 being well below average and 9 being considerably above average. So in terms of ethical character, what we found is that 85% of all of you who took this quiz ranked yourself as being more ethical, having higher degree of ethical character than the rest of you who are also taking this course. So what we saw is that on that scale of 1 to 9, it was nearly 7. So this was an aspect of it where it was about a personal quality. In terms of work habits, there was a little bit more distribution. I think either people were more honest or were feeling that having a lower work ethic, perhaps in the environment in which we live, is an asset. But still, we had nearly 70% who work harder than the rest of you. And in the last case, 76% of you are better drivers than everybody else. This one reflecting a physical and cognitive skill. So again, for most of us who have been driving for a long period of time, we feel it's pretty straightforward. Defining ourselves ethically, pretty straightforward. So that is an example where we have those high situations of everyone feeling that, or most people feeling that they are above average. I'm just looking, Corey's got a comment here. Yeah, work habits might also be easier to compare. So that might be a situation where it causes us to maybe not be quite as inflated. And yeah, tougher to compare ethics, but in terms of how we feel about that as a general, more broader attribute of ourselves, we obviously feel pretty good about it, and perhaps are making some assumptions about ethics that we might see in others, whether that's visible or not. So the last of the 3 O's is over precision, and that is thinking that we have a better sense of the truth and that our assumptions are the correct ones. So what we have a tendency to do here is that can cause us to apply tighter confidence intervals around something that is uncertain. We may not know the answer, but we are more inclined when we are overconfident to try to be very precise around what we know or think we know. We have a tendency when we are applying that to discount the views, or in some cases just the outright evidence that others are supplying, because we think that we have a better framework for knowing what is true or correct. And we also are more likely, especially if we have an expertise in a certain area, to trust our intuition. We rely on that to help guide us because we are an expert, and so therefore our gut is able to tell us more of what is true or accurate. So what we're essentially doing here, and if you look at those bullseyes on the left, the top one is a series of outcomes that are very precise but not very accurate. In the bottom one, much more accurate but more dispersed. So there's been a trade-off in terms of precision versus accuracy. And over precision basically says, we would rather accept a high risk of being wrong, of being off the mark or not hitting that bullseye, if when we are right, we tend to look smarter because we were trying to be very precise. And that's something that can help us feel better about ourselves in an uncertain situation. Don't know the full answer, but I'm going to be very precise, and it will help to convince me that I have a basis for that precision. And it can also help us to earn the confidence and the trust from other people. If we say in this uncertain situation, hey, what do I think the market is going to do next year? And I say, well, I think it's probably going to fall in a range of from down 10% to up 30%. That's not going to instill a tremendous amount of confidence. Even if I think this is an uncertain situation, that's the likely range. If I want to project that expertise, I'm much more likely to say, well, I think it's going to be up somewhere in the 18 to 22% range. And if I'm wrong, so be it. But if I'm right, people are going to ascribe a great amount of expertise to me. Danny Kahneman had a great quote about this aspect of overconfidence, which is referring to our almost unlimited ability to ignore our ignorance. And I think that is something, particularly in the realm of punditry and experts, something that we can see over and over again. What it essentially means is, and this is the way that this process works in our mind, is in a situation where we don't have perfect information, we take that information, we create the best narrative story around that we can come up with, and then we believe the hell out of it and totally convince ourselves that that is the way that the world works and that this situation is likely to play out. A good example of that is in interviewing. When you are interviewing people and form an opinion, so often the impressions that we have in that interview, something that we latch on to, the way the person appears, the way that they have answered a particular question, we then tie that to what we think the outcome is going to be of the entire period of time that they are working and contributing to that company. We're taking very limited, imperfect information and creating that narrative about how they're going to perform as an individual. Another great example of this, if we think back to former President George W. Bush, when he met Vladimir Putin for the first time, was insistent on what an honest, upstanding, good guy he was, because he was able to look into his eyes and see directly into his soul. And I think we all know how well that worked out. So this is another question from the survey. This was asking people to take what are very uncertain quantities and come up with a 90% confidence interval around these. So in general, with these 10 items, what you would come up with, if you did this correctly in setting those bounds, would be you would get 9 out of 10 of these correct because you had set a wide enough range. You can see here what the different items were and what the actual results were, but here's the distribution of results from those of you who took the quiz. Nobody actually got 90% confidence interval. In general, what we saw was that you got 4 out of 10. There were a number who got 0 or 1, a few who were closer, who were giving much more broad ranges. But still, even though we've been instructed and are in a safe environment to provide those ranges, our tendency is to try to be as narrow as we can, even on things that people have acknowledged they have absolutely no idea what a starting point is for those ranges. So what I want to get into now are some of the other situations where we see it. We highlighted some of those earlier, and some of you contributed on where you've experienced it, but some of the main areas where we tend to see it. One primary area, and David, you touched on this, is in the financial or investing decision-making arena. We have a tendency to trust our gut, as the colleague who wanted to buy Twitter the night before or the afternoon before they reported earnings. We have a tendency to take what are pretty tenuous data points and use that as a way to justify timing the market, why we think that the market's going to go up or down next year or how much. It causes us to assume that the information that we have about the market or about a company that is available to all the other market participants. David, I'll pick on you, but I'm pretty sure that when you bought GoPro, there wasn't any information that you had that was specific to you or that you'd uncovered that no one in the market had seen yet. But we have a tendency to feel that how we use that information is better than other people. It can cause us to inflate our ability to forecast uncertain outcomes, whether that is forecasting a company's earnings or the potential return on an investment. It also causes us to trade more often than is justified. we take those little pieces of information or our spidey sense about what the market is going to do from here, and it causes us to turn over our portfolios a lot more than would be ideal. The research has definitely shown that that has a negative impact on overall performance, but we can't help ourselves, we keep doing it. And what's interesting is not only does it cause us to have overly optimistic views of our future performance, it will also cause us to take our past investment performance, which should be in front of us in black and white or black and red as the case may be, and cause us to be more optimistic about how we actually did. So this is an arena where investment results are incredibly transparent. We can see how we did. We can compare our performance versus various benchmarks, but we still fool ourselves about how we did and how we're likely to do going forward again and again and again. Another area where we see it is in the healthcare arena. And so there are some studies that I want to cite here where we have seen in terms of providing a diagnosis to various patients, 95% of physicians are aware of the guidelines that are in place for treating high cholesterol. 18% decided to follow them because the others presumably, even though they knew that these guidelines had been set, either felt this was a unique situation or they had greater expertise, they were better than the guidelines and had a better sense as to how to proceed. There were experienced dermatologists who were confident in over 50% of the melanoma cases that they saw. 30% of the time, even though they were extremely confident, they were wrong. This next one is pretty acute in that there were physicians who were given a series of options as to how confident they claimed they were about a diagnosis of a patient who subsequently died in intensive care. Those who chose to say that they were completely certain in the diagnosis were found as a result of autopsies to have been wrong 40% of the time. And what we have also seen is that in a study that was done of radiologists, those who had the highest confidence and claimed to have the highest confidence when given a spectrum of confidence rankings to self-apply actually had the lowest level of accuracy. So what we can see on the left is that in totality, surveys that have been conducted, around 1% of physicians admit to having made a diagnostic mistake, which we can see in some of these studies on the right. The actual prevalence of that is considerably higher. So again, we can't allow the view that, well, every case is unique, have that allow us to ignore the base rates of what the likelihood of a certain diagnosis being accurate is. Another space that is near and dear to many of us is in the entrepreneurial arena. And what we see here is at the top chart, these are entrepreneurs who were estimating the success rate for all new ventures in the marketplace. The estimate was 60% are going to be successful. The actual 5-year success rate is about 1 in 3. So that was looking at just the total space. But when talking about their own likelihood of success, entrepreneurs were asked, how many of you feel that you have a greater than 70% of chance of being successful? The number who self-rated themselves as likely to succeed was 81%. And within that, 1/3 were 100% certain that they were going to be successful, even though only 1 in 3 in actuality make it beyond 5 years. So I think in a way that level of optimism and overconfidence may be a good thing for sustaining the amount of activity in the entrepreneurial space. As we say over and over and over again, if you're not an optimist, you shouldn't be an entrepreneur, but certainly there are some costs that come from that if you're not one of those who is able to achieve success. And then more generally, in terms of overall business decision making, there are several categories where we do see this play out. We see it happen in the negotiation setting, where overestimation causes us to feel that we are better skilled as negotiators. We think that we have a stronger position. We're less likely to accept what would be a mutually beneficial agreement because we think that we are in the stronger position. And it also, as we mentioned earlier, creates a tendency to overpay for M&A, even though the evidence is there in terms of results and the success rate for M&A. Planning, we talked about the planning fallacy earlier. It causes us to feel that we can do too much in too little time. We tend to ignore those base rates. So the examples that we've seen of similar projects, how much they cost, what resources are going to be required, but then we feel that we're going to be able to do it more efficiently. We have a tendency in that planning process to ignore what could be complications, what could be delays, what could be other snafus that cause this to not meet the rosy objectives or framework that we have established. And what this can also do is this can be something that ends up demoralizing us if we're not able to do that. It can also increase the failure rates that we see in terms of projects or in organizations that are dependent on some of these planning processes working out. I see from Dan, overpaying for M&A as in overpaying to acquire an organization. Yeah, that certainly is an example of where we've seen it, Dan. There is a lot of data in the public markets of the success rate of M&A. We can see it in a fairly persistent pattern of the stock performance of companies that announce M&A have a greater tendency than not to decline because the market identifies that the success rate is sufficiently low that and that there is a tendency to overpay for many deals, partly because there is that asymmetry of information. A buyer isn't going to have, even if they've conducted great due diligence, isn't going to have as much information about the target as the individual who's selling. If you find a price that is agreed upon, there is that asymmetry that causes the seller to actually, if they're willing to agree to it, perhaps with more information, you as a buyer might need to question why they're so willing to agree to it. So that's one situation, but we also see that in terms of the private market. It can also be in terms of paying for access to scarce resources where we might be willing to overpay. But it's a great question. And then where we also see it, we talked a little bit about interviewing, but in that hiring situation, where we are, as we talked about, overconfident in how we are able to assess people and then carry that forward into what that narrative is around future performance. And within all of these, there's a lot of interplay. And there are aspects that cause us to, some of these outcomes to kind of blend together. And it's not just overconfidence. As we go through more of the biases in subsequent sessions, we'll see how there are other biases that also contribute to some of these poor outcomes. So I just wanted to ask again, as we've gone through some of these examples, if that has sparked any other situations where you feel that you may have seen this, either industries or particular business or personal settings where you may have found some of these aspects pop up.
You know, I've seen this a bazillion times with me, and one of the things I'm having a hard time with is, you know, there's a balance between making a decision and confidently going forward with it, because indecision is almost worse a lot of the times. And so I guess what are your thoughts on how to balance and maybe mitigate some of the issues here while still making decisions and moving forward?
I think it's a great question, and I agree with you completely. It is a balance, and what we want to do is still be able to approach the decisions that we are making confidently, but not just relying on some of the assumptions, the intuitions, or the narratives that we are creating. And so I think it's actually, if you bear with me, we're going to transition into some of the tools and techniques that I think that we can use to augment still having a healthy sense of confidence as we go into making decisions, that we don't just lead to paralysis, but are able to help us maybe get away from some of that bias and make more effective decisions. Anyone else want to jump in with anything where you may have seen it? Nick's saying, I've seen it in myself and certain friends applying to colleges and maybe people's estimation of their own talent in academia in general when compared to their peers. Absolutely. I think that's another space. I didn't cite it here, but there have definitely been studies that have shown that that overconfidence, let's just say, is extremely alive and well in professional academia. And some of those self-reporting abilities where asked to rate themselves relative to their peers, some of the highest percentages of being above average we have seen show up in the academic setting. So I think that's a great one.
I can chime in with one too, Pete, kind of back to one of your original points. I find myself overconfident, on many things. The one that is particularly coming to mind is around kind of credit and or like origination or ownership. And I guess what I mean by that is I mean, for a large portion of my life, and I feel like I've made some improvement, though I do slip back into it. I was overconfident about, I'd say, the knowledge that I had amassed, or my ability to amass knowledge, and what that said, about like Bruce, right? And I think what helped me, I guess, with that is, most of the stuff that I was immersing myself in is the product of other people, in the sense that, I didn't really have any of those thoughts. I mean, I experienced them and I can understand them, right? And maybe that says something, but I don't know. That's what pops into my head.
Yeah, I think that's another great point. And part of that, in terms of making some of those decisions, it can be related to that planning fallacy that we talked about, right? We tend to assume certain scenarios and certain outcomes, and maybe it causes us to be more confident in making some of those decisions than if we were being perhaps more objective we might make. So I want to jump into getting into some of the techniques that we can use to really deal with this persistent overconfidence that has a tendency to show up whether we want to or not. One of the techniques that a guy named Gary Klein had identified is doing a pre-mortem, which is, if you are going to be undertaking a project or making a decision, as a starting point, look forward into the future and assume that it failed. And either yourself or for a team, diagnose why it failed. What that does is it helps you to identify and forces you in a way to identify some of those risks that simply relying on your intuition or the assumption that everything is going to work out great would ignore. And what it also does, particularly in a team environment, if you can present this exercise and you can lead it as a team leader, what it does is it signals to everyone that doubting or identifying some of these risks is not only a safe activity, but you're encouraged to do that. And I think that team members who may not speak up with some reservations, using this as a tool and an exercise can really help to identify that and leverage the group in identifying what might go wrong, and then gives you the opportunity to be able to zero in and preemptively mitigate some of those risks. Process is another really important one. And by minimizing the intuition through having documented processes, it doesn't mean that you do this to the exclusion of relying on expertise, But if you have a defined process that you know or feel confident works, that can be really helpful. And then augmenting that with a postmortem to identify and ensure that the process doesn't have any flaws or holes in it can be really effective. A great example of that, we talked about it the other day in Ethan White's session, is checklists. So Atul Gawande, who wrote the checklist manifesto, really was able to identify that in the hospital setting, implementing checklists, even if they seem relatively basic, was extremely effective in leading to better health outcomes. And I think it's something that we can see in our own lives. An example for me this summer that I fell prey to overconfidence. We did a lot of family camping trips, and thinking I probably should put a checklist together, but no, I've got this. I know what we need. And after one trip where we forgot all of the headlamps and flashlights, another trip where we, meaning me, forgot the fuel, it's something that I realized I was being overconfident and having an impact on the overall group experience because I felt that I had it when I really didn't. So having that though process, I'd like to say, process is the meat, intuition is kind of the gravy. And you can still apply in from intuition, some of your confidence in your abilities, but having an underlying process can really help. Another one is for projects, evaluating them at least as much based on the accuracy of what went into the plan as on the outcome. It's a double benefit that you get from doing that, because you end up getting better results as you go forward by really ensuring that people have a rigor that causes them to be as accurate as possible in forecasting the outcomes. And it also makes you more efficient because having that accuracy can lead to fewer cost overruns, delays, extensions, et cetera, that can be very, very financially costly. And it also has a carry forward benefit into establishing that as a process into future planning activities. Quantifying is important. So using that baseline of evidence-based medicine, if you have a cholesterol protocol that has been proven to work, then use that as your baseline and then augment. And certainly investment performance, we should all be, if we are evaluating how we did, let's use those benchmarks, let's use that historical performance so that we can be honest with ourselves about how we actually did, not just what we thought we did. Research. Make sure that we do research. If we are launching a product, if we are starting a company, let's understand the competitive analysis and not just assume, hey, we're smarter than most people, so we've got a better chance of success. If you have an established and viable competitor, then you should make sure that if you're not taking them seriously, you've really determined why that is the rational process to take. Understanding those base rates. Use the data that is available, use the odds and the statistical likelihood of an outcome as your baseline before making those decisions. Another really powerful one is incorporating outside views. Having a devil's advocate, allowing for dissent, allowing for challenges can be done in an incredibly respectful way within an organization or within a team. So whether it's having someone play that role within a team or bringing someone in from the outside who can help to challenge that and allow you then to test some of those alternatives is incredibly powerful in being able to minimize the influence that overconfidence has. In the negotiating situation, gauging what are referred to as BATNAs, which is the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. If you don't come to an agreement, if you're not able to do that, what is going to be the next best alternative? And are you comfortable with that? That will really help you to understand kind of what is that point over which I can come to an agreement. I'm willing to come to an agreement. And understanding what your interests are in pursuing negotiation in the first place, but also putting yourself in the position of the person that you're negotiating with or against, understanding what is their best alternative, what are their interest sets, can really help to minimize, again, that influence of overconfidence and causing us to think that we are in a better position than we are, and oftentimes overplay our hand. And lastly, in the interviewing situation, we've highlighted that a couple times. What can we do there? We can create and identify what are some objective criteria. In looking at many cases of interviews and how successful they were as employees, in many cases, people found that simply relying on an IQ test was a better predictor of eventual success as an employee than the perceptions that were created in an interview situation. It doesn't mean don't have interviews, but really establishing what are some objective criteria that we can apply across all of our candidates is a way to help ensure greater success. So with that, I just want to see, those are some techniques that have been proven to be effective, I think can work well. Is there anything else that you've found that has worked well in your situations?
Yeah, I'll chime in here. Two things I started doing actually. The end of every month, I sit down and just kind of like write out wins, losses for the month. But in the process, I really sit down and figure out like what worked with client calls, what worked well, what didn't, and like with my projects and everything, and really just kind of figuring out what worked, what didn't. The other thing I did was like 2 years ago, I started creating a spreadsheet of where all my leads are coming from and which ones of those are converting, so I can really start focusing my time on where I'm getting most of the people rather than all these places where I thought I was getting people, but wasn't really being an effective use of my time.
Those are great. That's obviously a very effective use of the data and doing that post-mortem to identify what worked or what didn't, rather than just allowing yourself to kind of create that narrative and allow your intuition to tell you what was working or what wasn't. So it sounds like that's also something that then you're using and incorporating into your activities as you go forward, which is a great way to cultivate that feedback loop. Does anyone else have anything that has worked for them? Or I know we're at the top of the hour. If there are any other final comments or questions that you have, would love to touch on that.
I just want to say, Pete, again, similar to your first session, the amount of insights and nuggets I'm just kind of collecting from this that helps me be more self-aware and analyze myself is absolutely exceptional. Just having this type of information top of mind allows better decision-making, better relationships, and then better usage of time. So I more just want to thank you for all the in-depth thought, details, nuggets, preparation, flow, and everything, because it's so just stimulating, and it's making me think of so many different things across the board. So I really just want to give an overarching thank you. Very well thought out. Questionnaires great. Going into overconfidence, I think a great bias to really dig into, because it's one of the ones that's hitting us all pretty hard and setting us back or forward, however we handle it. So in general, I just want to say thank you. I thought this was really well done, really well prepared.
Well, that's great. Thank you, David. And thanks to everyone for participating. Our next session is going to be on September 3rd. For that one, we're going to be drilling down into confirmation bias. So look forward to hearing your experiences with that next time. And as always, please provide any feedback that you have, and we're always open to suggestions for continuing to improve this. So thank you again for taking so much time today and for all of your input. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day. We look forward to talking soon.
Thank you.